The peaceful hum of daily life in the human colony of Epsilon 4 was shattered when the alarms blared. Commander Mira Kessler, a seasoned veteran who had seen her share of battles, rushed to the command center. The colony, located on the far edge of human-explored space, had been established as a resource hub, but its strategic importance had attracted unwanted attention. Status report. Kessler barked as she entered the room. Her eyes scanned the monitors, and her stomach dropped at what she saw. Lieutenant Cade Reland, one of the best pilots stationed on Epsilon 4, answered. "We've got incoming, Commander. Unknown vessels, but they're not friendly. They've already taken out 2 of our defense satellites." Kessler clenched her jaw. The colony had limited defenses, as it was primarily a civilian settlement, but that wouldn't stop her from doing everything in her power to protect it. "Raise shields, activate all defense systems. Get our fighters in the air," she ordered. The unknown vessels, sleek, dark, and disturbingly fast, came into view. A barrage of energy blasts struck the colony's outer defenses, causing explosions to ripple across the landscape. The Varnock, a species no one had encountered before, were here, and they weren't making any demands. Dr. Elena Park, the colony's chief scientist, was in the med bay when the attack started. She was no soldier, but she knew how to keep a level head in a crisis. "Prepare for casualties," she called to her team as explosions rocked the colony. Meanwhile, Cade suited up, preparing to lead the colony's fighter squadron. "You're not going out there alone, are you?" A voice called from behind him. It was Sect. Theo Maris, one of the ground soldiers assigned to protect the colony's perimeter. "Wouldn't be the first time," Cade replied with a grin, though his hands were shaking as he tightened his helmet. He was young, barely past 25, but he'd been through enough to know that this fight was going to push him, and everyone else, to their limits. Within minutes, the human fighters launched into the sky, their engines roaring as they climbed to meet the enemy. The Varnock ships, with their strange, fluid-like movements, swarmed the human defenders. Cade was already pushing his ship to the limit, weaving through laser fire and launching counterattacks. His squadron was outnumbered, but they had one advantage. Humans had learned to fight against impossible odds. As the battle raged above, Kessler coordinated the defense from the ground. "Redirect power to the shields," she commanded, her voice steady despite the chaos. The colony's power systems were strained, and they couldn't hold out forever. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the ground, sending a shockwave through the entire colony. One of the outer defensive platforms had been obliterated. Kessler winced, knowing they couldn't afford too many more losses. "Commander, we've got a breach," Haschit. Maris reported from his position on the colony's wall. "They're landing troops." Kessler felt a surge of frustration. The Varnock weren't just attacking from above. They were invading the colony itself. "Hold them off as long as you can," Kessler said, her mind racing. They needed more time, more firepower, anything to give them a chance to survive. In the sky above, Cade's squadron was getting torn apart. The Varnock ships were faster, more agile, and seemed impervious to damage. But Cade wasn't about to give up. He spotted an opening in the enemy formation, a narrow window of opportunity that could allow him to take down one of their larger vessels. "Cade, don't you dare," came the voice of his wingman, Lieutenant Arden Vale. "You're not going to make it out if you try that." "I'll make it. Just watch," Cade replied, his voice tight with determination. He angled his ship and accelerated toward the enemy vessel, ignoring the alarms blaring inside his cockpit. The Varnock ship loomed larger as he closed the distance, and at the last possible second, Cade fired a barrage of missiles directly into its engine core. The explosion was deafening, even from the ground. Cade barely had time to react as the shockwave from the destroyed vessel sent his fighter spinning out of control. He fought with the controls, his vision blurring as the G-forces pressed him into his seat. "Cade, pull up, Arden shouted, but Cade was barely conscious as his fighter plummeted toward the surface. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the fiery wreckage of the Varnock ship, now crashing down alongside him. Cade Ryland jolted awake, his body aching from the crash. His fighter was a smoking ruin around him, but somehow he had survived. Dazed, he unbuckled his harness and stumbled out of the wreckage. His mind was foggy, but the sight of burning buildings in the distance snapped him back to reality. The colony was still under attack. "Cade, can you hear me?" Commander Mira Kessler's voice crackled through his damaged comm unit. He slapped it, trying to get a clearer signal. "Barely. I'm down, but alive," he responded, shaking off the pain. His leg throbbed, and his vision was blurry, but there was no time to think about injuries. "You bought us some time with that stunt, but we're still losing ground. Get back to base if you can," Kessler ordered. Cade nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "On my way," he muttered. He looked around, spotting the outline of a half-destroyed supply truck nearby. He limped toward it, praying it still worked. Meanwhile, back at the command center, Kessler was fighting a losing battle. The Varnock had landed troops on the outskirts of Epsilon 4, and her forces were barely holding them off. Cheat. Theo Maris led a small team of ground soldiers, using the colony's terrain to their advantage, but they were severely outnumbered. "We're running out of ammo," Maris reported over the comms. His voice was strained, and the sounds of gunfire and explosions in the background made it clear just how bad the situation was. "Hold your position as long as you can," Kessler replied, her mind racing for solutions. She glanced at Dr. Elena Park, who was frantically coordinating the medical response from the bunker below. The wounded were piling up, and they were running out of supplies. Dr. Park worked tirelessly, her hands steady as she treated the injured. "We're doing what we can, Commander, but it's not enough. We need reinforcements, or we're going to lose this fight," she said, not looking up from the patient she was stitching up. Kessler knew she was right. The colony couldn't hold out much longer without a miracle. Above the colony, the few remaining human fighters were being overwhelmed by the relentless Varnock assault. The alien ships moved with an eerie precision, their sleek, black forms darting through the air like predatory birds. Lieutenant Arden Vale, Cade's wingman, was now leading the remaining pilots, but their numbers were dwindling fast. "Commander, I'm losing my squadron up here," Arden reported. "We're down to 5 ships, and these Varnock don't miss." "Do what you can to keep them occupied," Kessler ordered, but even she knew it was a delaying tactic at best. The Varnock had superior firepower, and there was no backup coming. They were alone. On the ground, sheet, Maris and his team were pinned down near one of the colony's storage facilities. The Varnock infantry had breached the perimeter, and the firefight was intense. Maris fired off another round from his rifle, hitting a Varnock soldier in the chest, but more kept coming. "They're pushing us back," one of his soldiers, Private Rook, shouted as he ducked behind a wall, barely avoiding a barrage of plasma fire. Maris gritted his teeth. "We're not giving up an inch. They'll have to pry this colony from our cold, dead hands." Rook looked at him, wide-eyed. "That might actually happen, sir." Maris just smirked. "Not today, Private. Not if I have anything to say about it." As the firefight raged, Cade finally managed to get the supply truck moving. It sputtered to life, and he floored the accelerator, speeding toward the colony's command center. The road was littered with debris and craters from the ongoing battle, but Cade navigated through it, his focus singular. Back at the command center, Kessler was growing more desperate. "Where the hell is Cade?" she muttered to herself, pacing in front of the comm panel. Before she could think too much on it, the power grid flickered and several monitors went dark. "We just lost the eastern grid," shouted Ensign Trill, one of the tech officers monitoring the systems. "We're running on backup power, but it won't last long." Kessler slammed her fist on the console. "We're running out of time. Get ready to evacuate the civilians to the underground bunkers. We'll hold the line as long as we can, but we need to save as many people as possible. As the command center prepared for the worst, Cade finally arrived, the supply truck screeching to a halt outside. He stumbled out, his face covered in soot and grime. "What did I miss?" he asked with a grin, despite the chaos around him. "Cade, you idiot," Kessler snapped, but there was relief in her voice. "We need every fighter we can get. Are you good to go?" Cade winced but nodded. "I'll manage." Before they could plan their next move, an explosion rocked the building, shaking the walls and sending equipment crashing to the floor. The Varnok were getting closer. "Commander, we've got incoming. They're about to breach the northern wall." "Ass cheat." Maris yelled through the comms, his voice strained with urgency. Kessler took a deep breath. "All right, everyone. This is it. We hold the line here. No retreat. We fight until the last breath." Kay picked up his helmet, wiping the blood from his brow. "You heard her. Let's show these aliens what it means to face humanity." The battle for Epsilon 4 wasn't over yet. The northern wall of Epsilon 4 trembled under the relentless assault of the Varnok forces. Plasma cannons, far more advanced than anything the colony had, pounded the outer defenses. Inside the command center, Commander Mira Kessler watched the status reports come in, each one worse than the last. Their defenses were crumbling. "Maris, I need you to hold that wall," she said into her comm. "I don't care what it takes." On the ground, said she, Theo Maris was hunkered down behind a pile of debris, his pulsed rifle at the ready. His squad was battered, exhausted, and running low on ammo, but they weren't giving up. The Varnok infantry, tall, insectoid warriors clad in sleek, dark armor, advanced steadily, their movements precise and unrelenting. "We're not going anywhere, Commander," Maris replied, firing another burst at an approaching Varnok soldier. "Just keep those evacuation routes clear." In the underground bunkers, Dr. Elena Park was working around the clock. The medbay was packed with injured civilians and soldiers alike, and the situation was becoming dire. She wiped the sweat from her forehead and continued stitching up a soldier's wound. "We're running out of supplies, Doctor," one of the nurses said, her voice strained with worry. "I know," Park replied grimly. "We'll just have to make do. Keep them stable, no one dies on my watch." She glanced at the monitors showing the colony's surface. The situation was dire, but there was no time to panic. The Varnok had superior numbers and technology, but the one thing they didn't have was the human spirit. Zora Thane, a civilian mechanic who had volunteered to help with the colony's defense, was busy rerouting power to keep the last remaining defense cannons operational. Sweat dripped down her face as she worked, her hands covered in grime. "I've got the EMP generator ready," Zora called out to Kessler over the comm. "But once we fire it, we'll lose power in this sector for a few minutes." "It's a risk we have to take," Kessler responded. "Do it." Zora didn't hesitate. She slammed her hand on the activation switch, and a low hum filled the air as the EMP pulse rippled out from the colony's central power grid. The lights flickered, then went out, plunging the colony into darkness. For a few tense moments, there was silence. Then the Varnok ships hovering above the colony faltered, their sleek forms flickering as the EMP disrupted their systems. Several of them spiraled out of control, crashing into the ground with deafening explosions. "Yes," Cade Ryland, back in action, cheered as he watched the alien ships fall from the sky. "That's what I'm talking about." But the victory was short-lived. Even as the Varnok ships crashed, their ground forces continued their assault. They had adapted, switching to backup systems as quickly as the humans had expected. "Commander, they're not stopping," Maris reported, his voice grim. "We slowed them down, but they're still coming." Kessler grit her teeth. "We just need to buy more time. The longer we hold, the better chance we have to evacuate everyone." Meanwhile, in the underground bunker, Dr. Park was dealing with her own crisis. Several civilians had been injured during the initial bombardment, and some of the children were starting to panic. She crouched beside one young boy who was clutching his arm, eyes wide with fear. "It hurts, Doctor," the boy whimpered. Dr. Park gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know it does, sweetie, but you're strong. You're going to get through this, just like everyone else here." Her voice was steady, but inside, she felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The injuries were becoming more severe, and without additional supplies, she wasn't sure how much longer they could keep going. Above ground, Kessler's eyes scanned the battlefield from her command post. The EMP had given them a brief respite, but the Varnok were already regrouping. She glanced at the tactical map, her mind racing. Every decision she made now would determine the fate of Epsilon 4. "Cade, I need you back in the sky. We've only got a few fighters left, and we need to keep them off our backs while we evacuate the last civilians." "On it," Cade replied. His body ached from the crash, and his leg was still throbbing, but he didn't hesitate. The only ship available was a half-damaged interceptor, but it would have to do. As Cade scrambled into the cockpit, the Varnok ground forces pushed closer to the colony's central compound. Maris and his remaining soldiers were doing their best to hold the line, but they were running out of everything: ammo, energy, and time. "Private, hand me another clip," Maris called, but Private Rook shook his head. "That was our last one, sir." Maris cursed under his breath. "Then we make every shot count." As the Varnok closed in, something unexpected happened. One of the Varnok soldiers, larger and more heavily armored than the others, stepped forward. Its mandibles clicked, and a voice, distorted and guttural, echoed through the comm channels. "Surrender, humans," the voice said. "Your resistance is pointless. Your people are broken." Kessler's eyes narrowed at the message. She keyed the mic, her voice cold and steady. "We don't know the meaning of surrender. You're in our territory now, and we fight to the last." The Varnok commander hesitated, clearly not understanding how these battered, wounded humans could still be standing. But before he could respond, Maris stepped forward, pulse rifle in hand, and fired a single precise shot. The Varnok commander fell, its body crumpling to the ground in a heap. For a moment, there was silence. Then, as if on cue, the human defenders let out a collective cheer. Against all odds, they were still fighting. They were still standing. Kessler took a deep breath. "We're not out of this yet, but we're far from beaten." As the last of the civilians were evacuated into the bunkers, Cade's fighter roared into the sky once more, joining the remaining ships in a desperate aerial battle. The colony's defenders, battered but unbroken, continued to hold the line. Humanity had been pushed to the brink, but as always, they refused to break. The roar of battle echoed through the air, a constant reminder of the peril that hung over Epsilon 4. Commander Mira Kessler wiped sweat from her brow as the latest reports came in. Casualties were rising. Supplies were critically low. Yet, the Varnok forces kept coming, relentless in their assault. Kessler stared at the holomap, which displayed the shrinking perimeter of their defenses. "How long until the evac ships are ready?" she asked, her voice tight with urgency. Lieutenant Arden Vale, coordinating the remaining fighter squadron from the ground after losing his own ship, answered grimly, 10 minutes, Commander. But I don't think we've got that much time." Kessler's heart sank. 10 minutes felt like an eternity in this battle, and the Varnok were closing in fast. The colony's shields had failed in several sectors, and the enemy troops were pressing their advantage. She knew what that meant. If they couldn't hold the line, everyone who hadn't made it to the bunkers was at risk. Down in the medbay, Dr. Elena Park was working frantically. Her hands moved with practiced precision, but there was no hiding the exhaustion etched on her face. The constant influx of wounded had pushed her and her team to the brink. "Doctor, we've lost another one," a nurse whispered, pulling a sheet over the body of a young soldier. Park closed her eyes for a brief moment, allowing herself the luxury of grief before she returned to her work. There was no time to stop. As she moved to her next patient, her mind raced. The injuries were becoming more severe: burns from plasma blasts, crushed limbs from collapsed buildings, and worst of all, the psychological trauma. Some of the soldiers hadn't just been physically injured, they were broken, staring into space as if their will to fight had been ripped from them. She looked over at Private Rook, who was lying on a stretcher, barely conscious after his squad had been overrun. He had lost his leg in the firefight, but that wasn't what worried her. It was the blank expression in his eyes. "Private, stay with me," Park said, gripping his hand. "You're going to make it." Rook's eyes flickered, focusing on her for a moment. I don't think I can do this anymore, Doc," he whispered, his voice weak. "They keep coming. We're not stopping them." Park's heart clenched, but she forced a reassuring smile. "We've been through worse, Rook. Humanity always fights back. You're stronger than you think." As Park continued treating the wounded, Zara Thane, the civilian mechanic who had become a key player in the defense, was still working tirelessly to maintain the colony's last functioning power grid. She had been awake for nearly 48 hours straight, but the thought of stopping never crossed her mind. Her fingers danced over the controls, rerouting power where it was needed most. The defense cannons needed every ounce of energy they could get, but the lights in several of the medical wings were already flickering. Zara's comm unit crackled to life. "Thane, we need more power to the northern defense grid. Now." It was set. Theo Maris, his voice strained from the constant firefight. Zara didn't hesitate, pushing the power levels to the maximum. "Done, but we're running on fumes, Sergeant." "Just buy us a few more minutes," Maris replied. On the front lines, Maris and his squad were fighting with everything they had. Plasma bolts and gunfire lit up the sky as the Varnok forces advanced, their black armored figures moving like shadows in the chaos. "Hold the line," Maris shouted, his pulsed rifle spitting fire as he picked off another Varnok soldier. His squad was down to less than half its original size, but the survivors fought with the desperation of those who knew they had no other choice. One of his soldiers, Corporal Danner, took a hit to the shoulder and went down with a scream. Maris rushed to his side, pulling him behind a piece of rubble for cover. "You're not dying today, Corporal," Maris growled as he bandaged the wound with one hand, still firing his rifle with the other. "I'm not so sure about that, Sergeant," Danner muttered through clenched teeth. Before Maris could respond, the ground shook violently. An explosion tore through the colony's southern sector, sending debris flying. The Varnok had breached another part of the colony's defenses. Kessler's voice came over the comms. "Maris, fall back to the inner wall. We can't hold them here." Maris cursed under his breath. They had fought so hard to hold the outer defenses, but it was becoming clear they couldn't win this fight through sheer force. "You heard the commander. Fall back," he shouted to his remaining soldiers. As they retreated, Kessler was already formulating a new plan. If they couldn't hold the colony, they had to protect the evacuation. The Varnok would reach the inner city soon, and they couldn't allow the civilians to be caught in the crossfire. "Cade, I need you in the air. Can you keep those ships off our backs while we get the last civilians out?" Kessler asked, her voice tight with the weight of command. Cade Rayland, barely holding himself together after his previous crash, climbed into the cockpit of a battered interceptor. He had pushed his body to the limit, but his mind was sharp, laser-focused on the task at hand. "Roger that, Commander. I'll buy you all the time I can," Cade said, powering up the ship's engines. He knew the odds were against him, but it didn't matter. As long as he was still breathing, he would fight. The interceptor took off, rising into the chaotic sky, where the remaining Varnok ships were circling like vultures. Cade gripped the controls, weaving through the onslaught of enemy fire, his heart pounding in his chest. Back on the ground, Zara Thane had done everything she could to keep the power grid operational. But the Varnok attack had taken its toll. She stared at the flickering monitors, her hands trembling from exhaustion. The comm unit crackled again. "Zara, it's time," Kessler's voice said softly. Zara nodded, though no one could see her. She knew what Kessler meant. The power was failing, and soon the colony's last defenses would be down. It was time to prepare for the worst. As the remaining civilians were loaded into evacuation ships, Kessler stood at the edge of the command center, watching as the Varnock breached the final wall. The colony was falling, but humanity wasn't done yet. "We're almost out of time," Kessler whispered, her gaze hard as she looked toward the horizon where Cade's interceptor fought against impossible odds. But we're not finished. The sky above Epsilon 4 was a chaotic battlefield, filled with the roar of engines and the whine of plasma cannons. Cade Rilland gritted his teeth as he banked hard, narrowly dodging a barrage of laser fire from a Varnock fighter. His interceptor was barely holding together, its controls sluggish and the engines running hot, but he pushed it to the limit. There was no other choice. The Varnock had sent their heavy assault ships into the fray, and Cade knew he was one of the last human pilots still in the air. His squadron had been whittled down to a handful of ships, and even those were hanging by a thread. Still, he fought on. "I've got your back, Cade," came Lieutenant Arden Vale's voice through the comms. Despite being grounded earlier, Arden had commandeered another ship and was now flying at Cade's wing. "Good to see you back in the fight, Arden," Cade replied, his voice tight with concentration as he looped around to target one of the Varnock's larger vessels. "Let's give them something to remember us by." The two ships swooped in, targeting the exposed rear engines of the Varnock assault craft. Cade fired a volley of missiles, and Arden followed up with precise plasma shots. The enemy ship shuddered, its hull fracturing under the combined firepower. Moments later, it exploded in a fiery blaze. "Nice shot," Arden cheered, but the victory was short-lived. More Varnock fighters descended upon them, forcing the human pilots to scatter. Cade's comm crackled with the voice of Commander Mira Kessler. "Cade, Arden, we need more time. The evacuation ships are almost loaded, but the Varnock are closing in fast." "Roger that, Commander," Cade responded, pushing his interceptor even harder. "We'll keep them busy." On the ground, the situation was equally dire. Cheat, Theo Maris and his remaining soldiers had retreated to the colony's inner perimeter, where they were making their last stand. Plasma fire lit up the night as the Varnock forces pressed their advantage, pushing ever closer to the heart of the colony. "We can't hold them here much longer, Sergeant," shouted Corporal Danner, his voice barely audible over the sounds of battle. Maris fired another shot, taking down a Varnock soldier, then ducked behind a pile of rubble. His breathing was labored, and his body ached from exhaustion, but he wasn't about to give up. "We hold them here, Corporal. We don't let them through." His mind raced, calculating their odds. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running low on everything from ammunition to energy. But he knew one thing: if the Varnock reached the evacuation zone before the ships launched, it would be a massacre. As the firefight raged on, Zara Thane was still working furiously in the control room. The power grid was failing, and she was doing everything she could to keep the last defense systems online. But the damage was too severe. With each passing second, more sections of the colony went dark. She wiped sweat from her brow, her hands trembling as she tried another reroute. "Come on, hold together, just a little longer," she muttered to herself. The screens flickered, showing intermittent power failures across the grid. Her comm unit buzzed to life. "Zara, we're running out of time," Dr. Elena Park's voice came through. "The medbay's power is failing. We've got critical patients here. If the systems go down, we won't be able to save them." Zara's heart pounded. She knew the colony's survival depended on keeping the evacuation ships powered, but hearing the desperation in Park's voice shook her. She stared at the power grid map, her fingers hovering over the controls. "I'll do what I can," Zara replied, her voice tight. She rerouted power from the remaining defense systems to the med bay, hoping it would be enough to keep the critical patients alive. But that decision left the colony's defenses even more vulnerable. Outside, Maris and his soldiers were fighting with everything they had. The Varnok were relentless, their black armored figures moving like shadows through the smoke and fire. Maris fired another round, taking down 2 more enemies, but the wave of Varnok soldiers seemed endless. "Sergeant, we've got movement on the west side," Dana shouted, pointing to a group of Varnok troops moving in a flanking maneuver. Maris cursed under his breath. "Hold them off. We can't let them get through." In the sky above, Cade and Arden were locked in a desperate aerial battle. The Varnok fighters swarmed around them, their sleek black ships darting through the air with deadly precision. Cade's ship shuddered as a plasma bolt clipped his wing, sending sparks flying across the cockpit. "I'm hit," Cade shouted, struggling to keep control of the ship. His hands gripped the controls, his knuckles white as he fought to stabilize the interceptor. "You've got this, Cade," Arden's voice came through, steady and reassuring. "Just keep flying." Cade gritted his teeth, forcing the damaged ship to stay in the fight. He dodged another barrage of enemy fire, his mind racing. They were running out of time. The evacuation ships were nearly ready, but if the Varnok breached the defenses before they launched, it would be over. On the ground, Kessler was directing the final stages of the evacuation. Civilians were being rushed onto the ships, and the wounded were being carried into the med bay. Dr. Park was still working tirelessly, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she treated the most critical patients. "We're almost there," Kessler muttered to herself. "Just a few more minutes." But those minutes felt like an eternity. Back in the sky, Cade's ship took another hit, and alarms blared in the cockpit. His systems were failing. He had to make a choice. "Arden, I'm going in," Cade said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "What? Are you insane?" Arden shouted. "I can't keep this ship in the air much longer. I'm going to take out their command vessel," Cade replied, his eyes locked on the largest Varnok ship hovering above the battlefield. "If I can disrupt their chain of command, it might give us the edge we need." "Cade, that's suicide," Arden yelled. "Maybe," Cade said, a small grin forming on his face. "But it's our best shot." Without waiting for a response, Cade pushed his interceptor to full throttle, aiming directly for the Varnok command ship. Plasma fire streaked past him, but he didn't waver. His mind was focused on one thing, giving the colony a fighting chance. As he closed in on the massive alien vessel, alarms blared louder, and the ship's hull began to glow red from the stress of the atmosphere. Cade fired his last remaining missiles, sending them straight into the heart of the Varnok ship's engine core. The explosion was blinding, and for a moment, everything went silent. Kessler watched from the ground as the Varnok command ship erupted in a massive fireball. The remaining Varnok forces hesitated, their movements faltering as their command structure was thrown into disarray. "Cade," Kessler whispered, her heart sinking. Arden's voice came through the comms, filled with shock and grief. He did it. The Varnok assault faltered, their forces thrown into chaos. Maris and his soldiers, seizing the opportunity, pushed back, driving the remaining Varnok troops away from the evacuation zone. "We've got them on the run," Maris shouted, his voice filled with a newfound energy. The evacuation ships roared to life, their engines glowing as they lifted off the ground. Civilians, wounded soldiers, and survivors of Epsilon 4 were finally being whisked away to safety. But Cade Rayland wasn't among them. As the Varnok ships retreated, Kessler stood in the command center, her hands shaking. The cost of survival had been high, but humanity had once again proven its resilience, its ability to endure even in the face of impossible odds. The evacuation ships lifted off, engines roaring as they carried the last survivors of Epsilon 4 into the sky. Commander Mira Kessler stood at the edge of the command center, watching the ships disappear into the atmosphere, her heart heavy. The colony had fallen, but they had managed to save most of the civilians. The Varnok, momentarily thrown into disarray by Cade Raylan's daring sacrifice, were retreating. But the cost had been high. Around her, the remaining soldiers of the colony gathered, their faces grim, their bodies battered from the relentless fight. The landscape was littered with the wreckage of buildings and ships, the air thick with the acrid smell of burning metal and smoke. The once thriving colony was now little more than a battlefield scarred by the ferocity of the Varnock assault. "We did it, Commander Asjeet," Theomaris said, limping over to her. His armor was scorched, and his left arm hung limp at his side, but his spirit was unbroken. "We held the line." Kessler nodded, but there was no joy in her eyes. "We survived, Maris, but we lost so much." She looked toward the horizon, where the Varnock fleet had disappeared, "and we lost Cade." Maris lowered his head. "He was a damn good pilot. If it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have made it this far." "None of us would have," Kessler agreed quietly. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. There were still things to be done. The survivors had to be accounted for, the wounded treated, and the colony's last few defense systems deactivated before they could fully retreat. In the makeshift med bay, Dr. Elena Park was tending to the injured, her hands moving with mechanical precision despite her exhaustion. Private Rook, still recovering from the trauma of losing his leg, lay in a cot nearby, his face pale, but his eyes filled with determination. Dr. Park glanced over at him, giving a small nod of encouragement before returning to her work. "We're alive," Rook whispered to one of the other wounded soldiers. "We made it." Dr. Park overheard and smiled faintly. "Barely, but we're still here." Further away, Zorathane was working with the remaining engineers, trying to salvage what was left of the colony's infrastructure. Her face was streaked with soot, and her hands were trembling from exhaustion, but she refused to stop. Every system they could recover might help them hold out a little longer, just in case the Varnock returned. But it was hard to ignore the silence that followed the battle. The hum of machinery was gone, replaced by the quiet, haunting echoes of a colony that had once been full of life. The quiet weighed heavily on all of them, a stark reminder of what they had lost. As the evacuation ships made their way to a safe zone in orbit, Kessler gathered her remaining officers in what was left of the command center. Lieutenant Arden Vale, still shaken by Cade's sacrifice, stood next to her, his face grim but resolute. "We need to make sure the Varnock don't come back," Kessler said, her voice steely. "They retreated this time, but they won't give up. Not after this. We've shown them that humanity won't just lie down and die." Maris, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch, nodded. They learned today that we're not easy prey. Dr. Park entered the room, her face drawn but calm. "Our wounded are stable, Commander. We've done what we can, but we'll need more supplies if we're going to keep everyone alive long enough to evacuate fully." Kessler appreciated her pragmatism. Parker kept so many alive during the chaos, even when the odds seemed impossible. "Thank you, Doctor. We'll make sure you get what you need." Arden spoke up next. "Commander, about Cade, we have to honor what he did. If it weren't for him, the Varnock would have taken the colony by now. His sacrifice—" "I know, Lieutenant," Kessler interrupted softly. She looked down, her throat tight with emotion. "He gave us a chance, and we won't forget that." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Cade's absence felt by everyone. He had been more than a pilot. He had been their hope when everything seemed lost. "Once the remaining ships are ready, we'll leave Epsilon 4, Kessler said, her voice steadying. "We can't hold this colony anymore. We need to regroup, rebuild, and prepare for the next fight. Because make no mistake, there will be a next time." Zara, still dirty from working on the power systems, looked up from her console. "And when they come, we'll be ready. We've learned from this fight. We know how to hit them back." Maris grunted in agreement. "Damn right. Next time, we'll be the ones on the offensive." Kessler nodded. "Next time we won't just survive. We'll make sure they never come after us again. The evacuation continued as the survivors of Epsilon 4 prepared to leave the broken colony behind. The air was heavy with grief for the fallen, but there was also a quiet, burning determination among the people. The Varnok had attacked them, thinking humanity was weak, but they had learned the hard way that humans didn't break so easily. As the last of the ships prepared to depart, Kessler stood on the edge of the platform, staring out over the ravaged landscape. The colony was lost, but humanity had endured. "We'll rebuild," she whispered to herself. "We'll fight back. For Cade, for everyone." The evacuation ship's engines roared to life as Kessler stepped aboard. The doors closed behind her, sealing off the world that had been their home and their battlefield. As the ship ascended into the sky, leaving Epsilon 4 behind, Kessler felt a quiet sense of resolve settle over her. The Varnok had underestimated humanity, and they wouldn't make that mistake again.